People think betrayal is a screaming match. I thought so too, until it wore an expensive linen shirt, complained about our newborn crying, and flew to a tropical paradise while quietly stealing my entire future. He assumed a bleeding, sleep-deprived mother, barely 10 days out of surgery, was too weak to fight back. He was dead wrong. Push a mother to the edge, and she does not break. She becomes a storm you can never forecast. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories, a channel that unfortunately has had its monetization completely disabled by YouTube, leaving us with absolutely no budget to continue operating. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to even longer, truer, exclusive stories with highly detailed situations that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors in a single narrative. You can easily join us by scanning the Patreon QR code right on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the description or the comments section of this video. Let us begin today's story about a brilliant woman named Samantha Vargas. I am 34 years old, and I have never felt as physically broken or spiritually hollow as I did standing in the dimly lit hallway of our Seattle home that night. The freezing rain lashed relentlessly against the tall glass windows, creating a harsh, drumming background noise to the piercing, desperate cries of my 10-day-old daughter, Eve. I held her fragile body tightly against my chest, swaying back and forth in a frantic rhythm, trying to soothe her while a sharp, burning agony radiated from my fresh C-section incision. I could feel a warm, terrifying dampness spreading beneath my oversized, milk-stained sweatpants, knowing with absolute certainty that my surgical wound was bleeding again from the physical strain. Across the polished hardwood floor, the heavy wheels of Julian's designer luggage glided toward the front door with a smooth, expensive hum. He stood there wearing a flawlessly tailored navy linen shirt, his hair perfectly styled, the air around him smelling faintly of imported bergamot and cedar wood. The contrast between us was deeply nauseating. I smelled of sour milk, cold sweat, and hospital iodine. I had not slept for more than 45 consecutive minutes in over a week. My eyes were sunken into dark, bruised shadows. My skin was pale and drawn, and I was running on absolute fumes, barely tethered to reality. Julian paused with his hand resting on the heavy brass doorknob. He did not look down at my bleeding abdomen. He did not look at his wailing, distressed daughter. Instead, he simply adjusted his crisp collar and let out a heavy sigh of irritation. "The baby is too loud," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of an ounce of empathy. "I need a break." I stared at him, my brain too fogged by profound exhaustion to fully process the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his words. Before my dry lips could even formulate a response, he pulled the door open, stepping out into the freezing night to meet his waiting luxury Uber. He was flying to the tropical paradise of the Maldives. He had justified it for days, claiming it was a critical retreat with his startup team, a strictly necessary step for his grand entrepreneurial vision. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the sudden silence of his absence was immediately shattered by Eve's escalating screams. He had just walked out on his bleeding wife and his sick newborn child, leaving me entirely stranded in a living nightmare. Before the pregnancy, I was the lead engineer at Oratech Biosolutions. I led massive teams. I solved incredibly complex algorithmic problems. I built revolutionary systems from the ground up. Now, I was just a ghost of that highly capable woman. I forgot to eat meals. I barely drank enough water to sustain myself. My entire existence was reduced to a desperate, frantic struggle to keep my fragile baby comfortable. Eve had developed a severe dairy allergy, causing her agonizing stomach cramps, aggressive rashes, and endless bouts of crying that tore at my soul. Exactly 5 days after Julian left for his crystal-clear oceans and white sand beaches, the real nightmare began. I had driven to the local grocery store in an absolute daze, wearing the exact same stained sweater from 3 days prior. My unwashed hair tied in a messy knot. I urgently needed a highly specialized, incredibly expensive hypoallergenic baby formula for Eve. My arms actually trembled from muscle fatigue as I carried the heavy cans to the checkout counter. The supermarket was packed with bustling, loud shoppers, and the harsh fluorescent lights glared down on me, making the pounding headache behind my eyes throb violently. The cashier quickly rang up the total. I handed over our joint credit card, desperate to pay and rush back to my crying baby waiting in the car seat. The cashier swiped the plastic card. The machine beeped an angry, rejecting red tone. "Declined," she said, looking up at me with a painful mixture of pity and annoyance. I blinked, utterly confused. "That is impossible. Please, try swiping it again." She swiped it again. Another sharp beep. Declined. The long line of people behind me shifted impatiently, whispering among themselves. A hot, prickling flush of deep humiliation crept up my neck and burned my cheeks. I mumbled a pathetic apology, leaving the desperately needed formula sitting right there on the counter, and practically ran out into the rainy parking lot, pushing the heavy stroller with violently shaking hands. Once I was safely locked inside my cold car, with the Seattle rain drumming heavily on the roof, sheer panic began to set in. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I pulled out my phone and logged into our joint banking application. I expected to see a simple fraud alert or a temporary bank error. Instead, what I saw made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Our shared savings account, the financial safety net we had painstakingly built together over years of hard work, was entirely decimated. Exactly $65,000 had simply vanished. I checked the transaction history, my hands shaking so violently I could barely tap the glowing screen. The money had not been stolen by some anonymous hacker. It had been wired out exactly 24 hours earlier, transferred directly to an obscure corporate account I had never heard of or seen before. It was a shell company. I could hardly breathe. The damp air in the car felt thick, actively suffocating me. I dialed Julian's number. It went straight to his automated voicemail. I called again, and again, dozens and dozens of times, my thumbs frantically hitting redial while hot tears of pure terror, confusion, and ultimate betrayal streamed down my face. Finally, my phone vibrated with a single, incoming text message from him. I opened it immediately, expecting a panicked explanation, a sincere apology, or some kind of desperate excuse about a bank mistake. Instead, I read a line so incredibly superficial and dismissive, it felt like a physical, brutal slap across my face. I had to use the funds to cover networking and diplomatic expenses for the project. The message read, "Do not blow this out of proportion. Just focus on taking care of the baby." I did not cry after reading that text message. The sheer audacity of his response acted like a bucket of ice water over my shattered nervous system, snapping me out of my paralyzing despair. The suffocating fog of postpartum exhaustion evaporated, replaced instantly by a sharp, highly functioning adrenaline. I picked up my phone and called my younger sister. Elena, I told her I had an emergency. She arrived at my house in less than 45 minutes, the tires of her car screeching against the wet pavement of our driveway. When Elena walked through the front door, she took one look at my pale face and immediately took Eve from my trembling arms. "Go take a shower, Sam," she told me softly, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "I have the baby for as long as you need. Just breathe." But I did not need a shower. I did not need to breathe. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. At 2 o'clock in the morning, while Elena gently rocked Eve to sleep in the nursery upstairs, I sat entirely alone in the dark, freezing kitchen. I was hooked up to my breast pump, the rhythmic, mechanical whirring sound echoing loudly in the absolute silence of the house. My eyes locked onto an old silver iPad sitting forgotten on the corner of the kitchen island. It was Julian's old tablet. He had upgraded to a newer model over 6 months ago and abandoned this one in a drawer. But I knew he was notoriously arrogant and incredibly careless with his digital security. I unplugged the device from the wall charger and pressed the power button. The bright screen illuminated the dark room, blinding me for a brief second. Just as I suspected, he had forgotten to disable the automatic cloud synchronization before tossing it aside. My heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I tapped the mail application. There they were, hundreds upon hundreds of synchronized emails, flowing in real time directly from his phone in the Maldives to the tablet in my hands. I bypassed his personal folders, completely ignoring the generic spam and travel confirmations, and went straight for his flagged business communications. It took me exactly 12 minutes of methodical scrolling to find the smoking gun. It was an extensive email thread with a high-profile intellectual property lawyer based in San Francisco. The subject line read, "Expedited Filing Protocol." My hands felt numb as I opened the attached digital invoice. The legal retainer fee was exactly $65,000. Julian had taken the entirety of our family savings to pay a premium, rush processing fee to quietly and swiftly secure a patent. But a patent for what? He was a marketing guy, a smooth talker who sold ideas, not a developer who actually built them. I downloaded the attached technical dossier. As I read the first paragraph of the executive summary, the air physically left my lungs. The room started to spin. It was a highly advanced biofiltering algorithm designed to isolate specific cellular anomalies in real time. It was my algorithm. For 2 grueling years before I went on maternity leave, I had poured my absolute soul, my endless overtime, and my pure intellect into writing and refining that exact code in the highly secure laboratories at Oratech Biosolutions. It was my intellectual property, my life's work, my absolute masterpiece. And here was Julian, actively registering my genius under the name of his newly formed shell company, Apex Dynamics. He was literally stealing my brain. He was taking the very foundation of my entire professional career and claiming it as his own midnight epiphany to a lawyer who knew absolutely no better. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously and coldly calculated, that my hands stopped shaking entirely. The weeping, abandoned wife died right there at the kitchen counter. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. I was no longer a victim. I was a lead engineer looking at a severely compromised system, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a system. I kept digging through the digital trail, my eyes scanning lines of text with predatory focus. If he had brazenly stolen my life's work, what else was he hiding in plain sight? I opened a secure folder labeled Real Estate Assets. Inside was a digitally signed lease agreement for a luxury penthouse apartment overlooking the downtown Seattle skyline. He had diverted a massive portion of the stolen funds to pay a hefty security deposit and 6 months of advance rent for a sprawling property I had never once heard him mention. I scrolled down to the very bottom of the lease agreement to check the authorized signatures. There was Julian's arrogant, sweeping handwriting. Right next to it, on the line specifically designated for the legal cosigner, was another name, Chloe. Chloe was his 23-year-old executive assistant, the same bright-eyed, overly eager young woman who was currently accompanying him on his vital startup retreat in the Maldives. She was not just fetching his morning coffee and managing his calendar. She was moving into a multi-million-dollar penthouse funded by my stolen savings, built on the back of my stolen algorithm, while I sat in the dark, bleeding from surgery, struggling to feed our sick newborn child. I disconnected the breast pump and set the bottles carefully on the cold marble counter. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window pane. The tired, broken mother was gone, replaced by someone entirely different. Julian thought he could strip me down to absolutely nothing, leaving me defenseless and occupied with dirty diapers while he built a massive empire on my stolen brilliance. But he forgot one crucial detail. I built the digital architecture he was trying to stand on, and I knew exactly where all the hidden load-bearing walls were located. I did not shed a single tear for the rest of that night. Tears are a biological response to pain, and I was no longer in pain. I was simply a highly optimized machine processing raw data. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and I had already drafted a secure, encrypted message to the one man in Seattle who hated Julian just as much as I did. His name was Marcus, 2 years ago. Marcus had been Julian's founding partner in a mid-level venture, right up until Julian orchestrated a brutal, backroom corporate coup that stripped Marcus of his equity and forced him out of his own building. I knew Marcus had been quietly waiting for a chance to exact his own brand of vengeance. Now, I was handing him the loaded weapon. We met exactly 48 hours later in the heavily soundproofed conference room of a downtown law firm. Elena was at my house watching Eve, allowing me to step into this high-rise fortress of glass and steel with absolute focus. Sitting across the mahogany table from Marcus and me was Beatrice. Beatrice was not just a lawyer. She was a legendary apex predator in the highly specialized ecosystem of corporate divorce and asset warfare. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and possessed the cold, calculating eyes of a sniper. I slid the printed copies of Julian's intercepted emails, the patent filing dossier, and the penthouse lease agreement across the table. Beatrice reviewed the documents in total silence. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of paper. When she finally looked up, a sharp, terrifying smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Most betrayed spouses want to burn the house down immediately," Beatrice said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the patent application. "They want to scream. They want to cancel the credit cards. They want to intercept the legal filings before they go through. That is exactly what your husband expects you to do if you somehow find out. We are not going to do any of that." I leaned forward, my chest tightening. "You want me to just let him steal my intellectual property?" "I want you to let him hang himself with it," Beatrice corrected smoothly, her voice a low, lethal hum. "Right now, this expedited patent application is merely an attempt at theft. It is a civil dispute, but if we let Julian successfully file this document with the federal government under penalty of perjury, falsely claiming he is the sole creator of the architecture, he crosses a massive legal threshold. Once the ink dries on that federal registry, it ceases to be a simple marital dispute. It becomes a documented, undeniable act of federal wire fraud and perjury. We do not interrupt his crime. Samantha, we let him finish it, and then we lock the cage." The sheer, elegant brutality of her logic was intoxicating. I nodded slowly, fully embracing the trap. But to make the trap completely inescapable, I needed to reinforce the steel bars. That evening, wrapped in a thick blanket with my laptop glowing in the dark nursery, I initiated a virtual private network connection directly into the highly secure mainframe of Oratech Biosolutions. As their lead engineer, my legacy credentials were still fully active, albeit deeply buried in the system architecture. My fingers flew across the keyboard, entering command lines with muscle memory. I bypassed the standard security protocols, moving silently through the digital corridors of the company I had helped build. I located the central repository where my biofiltering algorithm was stored. I was not there to alter the code. I was there to mathematically encrypt the absolute truth. I triggered an irrefutable, cryptographic audit of the server logs. I compiled every single keystroke, every version control commit, and every hidden timestamp that definitively proved I had written the baseline code entirely by myself over 18 months before Julian had even registered his ridiculous shell company. I bundled the massive data packet, secured it with a dual-factor encryption key, and transferred it to Beatrice's secure server. The digital paper trail was now completely bulletproof. Julian was building his grand castle on a foundation of quicksand, and I held the only switch to the seismic detonator. The final piece of the puzzle came from Marcus. He had spent the last 2 days calling in old favors and tapping his extensive network of Silicon Valley insiders. "He is not just casually pitching this to a few friends," Marcus told me over a secure phone call, his voice crackling with anticipation. "The exact day he flies back from the Maldives, Julian is hosting a massive, highly exclusive investor gala at a private art gallery downtown. He is planning to unveil the algorithm as his flagship product. He is going after the big sharks. He wants $10 million in seed funding on night one." The arrogance was almost poetic. Julian was not just going to steal my work. He was going to parade it around in a tuxedo in front of the most powerful venture capitalists on the West Coast. I hung up the phone and looked down at the thick stack of legal documents Beatrice had sent over for my signature. There were the divorce papers, demanding absolute, sole physical and legal custody of Eve. Right beneath them was an emergency ex parte order designed to instantly freeze every single financial asset Julian possessed the moment a judge signed it. I clicked my pen, signed my name on the dotted lines with a steady, unyielding hand, and started the countdown. The storm was fully prepared, and my husband was blissfully sailing straight into the center of the hurricane. For the next 10 days, my existence split into two entirely separate realities. The first was a highly curated, nauseatingly filtered digital illusion broadcast directly from the Indian Ocean. Despite claiming to be on a rigorous, exhausting working retreat, Julian could not resist the seductive pull of social media validation. My phone practically buzzed every few hours with notifications of his public posts. There was a high-definition video of him paddleboarding across crystal-clear turquoise waters, his tanned skin glistening under the tropical sun. There was a candid shot of two crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne resting on a pristine white mahogany deck, strategically cropped just enough to hide whoever was holding the second glass. The caption beneath it read, "Heavy is the head that wears the crown," taking a brief moment to recharge from the immense pressure of being the sole provider for my family. I read that specific caption while sitting in the dim glow of my home office, balancing my peacefully sleeping daughter in the crook of my left arm. Thanks to the specialized hypoallergenic formula and the relentless, round-the-clock support from my mother and my sister Elena, Eve was finally thriving. The agonizing red rashes had faded from her soft cheeks, and her constant, pained screaming had surrendered to quiet, contented sighs. With my baby finally healthy and comfortable, my mind was entirely free to focus on the destruction of her father. My right hand moved smoothly across my mechanical keyboard, writing lines of complex syntax in absolute silence. I was building a digital Trojan horse. It was a highly sophisticated sequence of logic bombs, deeply embedded within a seemingly harmless structural update, a kill switch. It was designed to remain completely dormant, completely invisible to any standard diagnostic scan, right up until the exact moment a specific execution command was triggered. The sheer arrogance of his plan was his greatest vulnerability. Julian was a brilliant salesman, but he was technologically illiterate when it came to the actual mechanics of my architecture. He knew how to pitch the algorithm, but he had absolutely no idea how to compile the final executable file for a live demonstration. I knew, with absolute certainty, that he was going to hit a massive roadblock before his big presentation. Exactly 48 hours before he was scheduled to land back in Seattle, my phone vibrated with a direct text message from him. "Hey, just checking in. Hope you and the baby are surviving," he wrote, opening with a painfully transparent layer of fake, distant concern. A minute later, the real reason for his message arrived. "Listen, my lead developer out here is running into a tiny compilation error for the pitch demo. Since you still have legacy admin access at Auratech, could you quickly pull up the old beta framework and send me the foundational library patch? It will save me hours of debugging, and I am already exhausted." He was trying to trick his heavily postpartum, supposedly oblivious wife into handing him the final missing piece of the stolen puzzle. He assumed my sleep-deprived brain would just blindly comply to avoid an argument. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, predatory grin of a trap snapping shut. "Of course, Julian," I typed back, my fingers steady. "I know how hard you are working for us. I will send the encrypted file right now. Good luck with the rest of the retreat." I attached the file containing my beautifully disguised kill switch and hit send. It flew across the globe, landing directly in his inbox. He replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. He had just willingly downloaded his own execution warrant, completely convinced he had pulled off the ultimate manipulation. The evening of the investor gala finally arrived. The relentless Seattle rain had returned, slicking the city streets with a dark, cinematic gloss. I stood alone in the center of my master bedroom, staring deeply into the full-length mirror. The exhausted, broken woman in the milk-stained sweatpants was completely gone. I had meticulously showered, washing away the smell of fear, hospital iodine, and forced submission. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style that left my face entirely exposed. I was wearing a sharply tailored, obsidian black blazer over a crisp silk blouse, paired with high-waisted trousers that expertly concealed my healing surgical wound. I slipped my feet into a pair of black leather stilettos. I looked at my eyes in the reflection. They were cold, focused, and entirely devoid of mercy. I was no longer a discarded wife pleading for basic human decency. I was a warrior stepping onto a battlefield that I had entirely rigged with explosives. I picked up my clutch purse, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the door to destroy my husband. He had stormed through our front door exactly 3 hours before the event, dragging his designer luggage across the hardwood floor. He still carried the faint, sun-baked scent of the tropical ocean on his skin, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the baby wipes and formula that consumed my world. He did not ask how I was recovering. He barely even cast a fleeting glance toward the bassinet, where Eve was finally sleeping peacefully. "I have the biggest pitch of my entire life tonight. Do not wait up." He had tossed over his shoulder casually. He disappeared into the master bathroom, quickly changing into a freshly pressed, custom-tailored tuxedo before vanishing back into the damp Seattle night. He genuinely thought I would just sit on the sofa in my sweatpants, meekly accepting my role as the discarded collateral damage of his ambition. Exactly 1 hour after his departure, I stepped out of the back seat of a sleek black town car in front of the Lumiere Art Gallery. The venue was a spectacular fortress of modern wealth situated right in the heart of the downtown arts district. It was buzzing with the Silicon Valley elite, high-profile venture capitalists, and the low, elegant hum of a live string quartet. Elena walked confidently by my right side, smoothly pushing a state-of-the-art, acoustically sealed luxury stroller. Inside it, Eve was sound asleep, completely isolated from the overwhelming noise of the outside world. As we glided past the velvet ropes and entered the main exhibition hall, heads immediately began to turn. The transformation was absolute. I scanned the sprawling sea of tailored suits and sparkling evening gowns until my eyes locked onto my target. Julian was standing near a towering ice sculpture, holding a crystal glass of champagne. Right beside him, laughing brightly at something he had just said, was Chloe. She was wearing a stunning backless emerald silk dress that I instantly recognized from the transaction history of our drained joint savings account. The exact moment Julian looked up across the crowded room and saw me walking toward him, the blood completely drained from his face. Chloe visibly recoiled, her champagne glass trembling so hard the liquid nearly spilled over the edge. Panic flared wildly in Julian's eyes for a fraction of a second before his polished, sociopathic survival instincts kicked into high gear. He abruptly stepped away from his young mistress and hurried toward me, plastering on a bright, thoroughly fake smile for the benefit of the surrounding crowd. He wrapped his arm tightly around my waist, his fingers digging sharply into my ribs as a silent, aggressive warning. "Darling, what an unexpected surprise. I thought you were far too tired to make it out tonight," he hissed through heavily gritted teeth, his voice pitched perfectly so only I could hear the venom in it. "I would never miss your grand moment of truth," I replied, my voice remarkably smooth and perfectly pleasant. Before he could attempt to subtly steer me toward the nearest exit, a towering, silver-haired man approached our circle. It was Elias Thorne, the legendary venture capitalist billionaire who was heavily rumored to be injecting $10 million of seed funding into Apex Dynamics by the end of this very night. Julian instantly released his punishing grip on my waist and beamed brightly at the imposing billionaire. "Elias, I would absolutely love for you to meet my wonderful wife, Samantha. She has been my absolute rock during this incredibly grueling development process." Julian lied effortlessly. Elias offered a firm, commanding handshake, his sharp, analytical eyes evaluating me intently. "It is a distinct pleasure to meet you. Samantha, Your husband tells me he has spent the last 18 months coding this revolutionary algorithm during countless sleepless nights. I looked directly into Julian's terrified, widening eyes and offered a brilliant, razor-sharp smile. Oh, he certainly spent his nights doing something extraordinary. Elias, I absolutely cannot wait to see what he presents to you all tonight. A few minutes later, the overhead gallery lights dimmed to a soft, dramatic glow, signaling the beginning of the main event. The affluent crowd migrated toward the center of the room, taking their seats in neat rows facing a massive, high-definition projection screen. Julian stepped up onto the elevated stage, completely in his element. He adjusted his lapel microphone, projecting the magnetic, visionary persona he had spent years perfecting in corporate boardrooms. He paced the stage slowly, gesturing dramatically as he spun a breathtaking, captivating web of total fabrication. He spoke passionately about the grueling hours of intense isolation, the sheer, mind-bending technical complexity of the biofiltering architecture, and the immense personal sacrifices he had supposedly made to bring this revolutionary medical product to life. "This is not merely a conceptual idea," Julian announced, his voice echoing powerfully through the silent, captivated room. "This is a world-changing algorithm, developed entirely by my own two hands through pure, relentless dedication. And tonight, I am not just going to talk about the future, I am going to show it to you." Julian pulled a sleek black remote from his pocket and confidently pressed the central button to initialize the live beta demonstration. The massive screen behind him flickered to life. The crowd leaned forward in collective, eager anticipation. But the sleek, futuristic user interface Julian was expecting to see did not appear. Instead, the screen froze completely for exactly 2 seconds. Then, it violently flashed a blinding, aggressive crimson red. A blaring, synthetic security alarm tone pulsed through the gallery's expensive surround sound system, echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. Across the 50-foot digital display, massive, stark white letters materialized, casting a harsh red glow over Julian's panicked face. "Warning severe. Copyright infringement detected. Proprietary digital architecture belongs exclusively to Auratech Biosolutions. Lead author and sole creator, Samantha Vargas." A collective, echoing gasp ripped through the audience of wealthy investors. Julian froze entirely, his mouth hanging open in sheer terror as he frantically mashed the buttons on his remote control, desperately trying to shut the display down. The remote was entirely dead. The presentation was no longer running from his laptop. My carefully embedded kill switch had completely hijacked the gallery's central projection feed. Then, the massive screen transitioned. Alongside the blaring federal copyright warning, highly confidential, high-resolution documents began to populate the display like a devastating slideshow of his sins. The first document was a certified bank statement with highlighted rows, broadcasting the exact, unauthorized transfer of $65,000 from our joint family savings account directly to his corporate shell company. The second image was the digitized, legally binding lease agreement for the luxury downtown penthouse, clearly displaying both his signature and the signature of Chloe, his 23-year-old assistant, who was currently shrinking away into the dark shadows near the exit doors. The final, fatal image was a complex, side-by-side diagnostic comparison of the core source code. On the left, it displayed my original, digitally authenticated creation timestamp from exactly 2 years ago. On the right, it showed his wildly fraudulent, expedited federal patent application filed merely 1 week prior. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely pulverized him in front of the most powerful people in the city. The silence in the gallery was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic hum of the digital projector casting its angry red light across the stunned faces of the Valley elite. Julian stood frozen behind the podium, his breathing ragged and shallow, looking exactly like a cornered animal trapped in the headlights of an oncoming train. Elias Thorne was the very first person to move. The billionaire slowly stood up from his front row seat. He reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke suit jacket and withdrew the thick, beautifully bound investment contract that was meant to guarantee Julian $10 million. With agonizing slowness, Elias tore the heavy parchment completely in half, letting the pieces fall silently to the polished floor. "You are a pathetic garbage thief," Elias said, his voice entirely devoid of anger, which somehow made the insult vastly more terrifying. He turned his back on the stage and immediately walked toward the exit. That was my cue. I walked calmly up the short flight of stairs and stepped onto the stage, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing powerfully through the massive room. Julian shrank away from me, his shoulders completely caved in. I did not even look at him. I turned to face the remaining investors, offering a polite, composed smile. In case there was any lingering confusion, I projected my voice clearly across the hall. "The biofiltering architecture you were just promised operates on a dynamic cellular anomaly isolation matrix. It requires a continuous feedback loop running through a proprietary neural network to identify and isolate targeted biological pathogens within a 12-millisecond latency window. It is highly complex, incredibly delicate, and it took me exactly 2 years of agonizing trial and error to perfect the foundational logic gates." I paused, letting the heavy technical jargon settle over the room, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt who the real architect was. My soon-to-be ex-husband does not even know how to compile a basic executable file. Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the gallery swung wide open. Marcus strode confidently down the center aisle, looking remarkably satisfied. Right beside him was a man in a beige trench coat holding a massive stack of legal documents. The process server walked straight up to the edge of the stage and shoved the papers directly into Julian's trembling chest. "Julian Vargas, you are officially served," the man stated firmly. Marcus looked up at Julian, a vindictive smirk playing on his lips. "That packet contains a federal lawsuit for corporate intellectual property theft, a notification of pending federal wire fraud charges regarding your little expedited patent stunt, an emergency asset freeze, and a unilateral divorce petition demanding absolute sole custody of your daughter. Enjoy the reading material, buddy." Julian completely collapsed. His knees physically gave out, and he hit the stage floor, his tailored tuxedo wrinkling pathetically as he stared blankly at the massive pile of legal destruction in his hands. I did not stay to watch him hyperventilate. I calmly walked off the stage, reunited with my sister Elena, and headed out into the cool Seattle night. By the time we reached the waiting town car in the parking lot, I heard the frantic, desperate slapping of footsteps on the wet pavement behind us. It was Julian. His flawless hair was completely ruined by the drizzle, his face entirely red and streaked with terrified tears. "Samantha, please," he openly sobbed, dropping to his knees on the wet asphalt right beside the car door. "Please, you have to stop this. I lost my mind. I was just so pressured. The baby was crying so much. I could not sleep. I was not thinking straight. It was the stress. I swear. Please, do not take everything away from me." I reached into the acoustic stroller and gently lifted Eve into my arms. She was perfectly asleep, completely unbothered by the damp air or her father's pathetic wailing. I held her close to my chest and looked down into his desperate, bloodshot eyes. "Do you see?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet colder than the winter rain. "She sleeps so wonderfully when she does not have to listen to your noise. And honestly, so do I." I turned my back on him, slid into the warm leather seat of the car, and closed the door firmly. I never looked back. Exactly 8 months later, the dust had entirely settled. Julian was convicted of federal wire fraud and perjury, currently awaiting transfer to a federal penitentiary while completely buried in insurmountable bankruptcy debt. His little shell company was dissolved, and his young assistant had vanished the very night the scandal broke. As for me, I accepted a massive promotion. I am now the Vice President of Technology at Auratech Biosolutions. I oversee an entire division. I legally own every single line of my algorithm, and I bought a beautiful new house with a sprawling garden. Every single evening, I sit on the porch and watch the sunset while Eve plays happily on the grass. We are safe, we are thriving, and our world is beautifully, perfectly peaceful. Thank you all so profoundly for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story compelling, please consider helping us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community. You will get to hear the absolute best, most intense, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the description and pinned comment.